How does a Formula One weekend work? When do the activities start and when do they end? Did you know, for example, that things actually start on Thursday and that drivers and teams are required to be there already? That's right, a lot happens well before you even think about sitting on the couch and turning on the TV. In fact, weeks before. And that's what we're going to talk about today on Splash and Go. In detail, taking a closer look and explaining to you everything that happens throughout the weekend, both on and off the track, and how these two sides interact. Let's go! Formula One Grand Prix is a spectacle of technology and organization, and I can't help but mention the famous phrase by 𝘾𝙤𝙥𝙮𝙧𝙞𝙜, who used to say, and still says, that we organize a World Cup every 2 weeks. And what exactly is he talking about after all? He's talking about the enormous task of connecting more than 220 countries in a network, receiving the television signal, and nowadays also the internet, an immense flow of data, all organized, without failures, without delays, with something ridiculously well planned, believe it or not, minute by minute. Things start weeks before, and to be honest, sometimes even months before Formula One even thinks about going to a country. And I promise, Scout's honor, I will re-record the Formula One logistics video. Some of the simpler equipment, like those temporary structures they use to set up the garages, the pit wall, computer monitors, and so on, are shipped to the countries on a rotating schedule months in advance. The structures, the cheaper, more easily replicated ones, unlike cars, engines, suspensions, and so on, make up kits, usually 5, that travel the world by ship. So for example, the kit that will arrive in Interlagos for the São Paulo Grand Prix in November often left Europe by ship after being used, say, in Barcelona. And the one that will be used in Abu Dhabi sometimes came by plane and truck straight from Singapore, and so on. As a rule, the cheaper parts and the most essential items, as I mentioned, like car parts and so on. The garage starts being assembled on Tuesday, and it needs to be ready by Wednesday at night, because on Thursday the cars have to be presented to the FIA. But hold on, we'll get to that soon. The racetrack needs to be ready the week before. And sometimes delegations from the International Automobile Federation come to check on alterations, renovations, or changes that were requested. Here at Interlagos, for example, it's common for the racetrack to close at the end of August for the works and touch-ups that happen every year to make the racetrack, which is used intensively all year long, look spotless, nicely painted with the grass trimmed. On Tuesday and Wednesday, packages, crates, and cases are opened and unpacked, and everything starts to take shape into the garages that will see all neat and tidy for the first free practice on Friday. It's a rush of trucks, forklifts, cases being opened, everyone putting everything in its place because the tools need to be ready. Everything has to be ready even before Friday's free practice, because after all, it's a mad dash of people on foot, boxes going here, forklifts going there, small trucks, everything being set up, from the team's catering and buffets to the plumbing installations, so the tools can work, so those monitors can get their internet cables, networks running back and forth. And who sets all this up, you might ask? The team staff themselves. There is a basic infrastructure, of course, compressed air, electricity, internet, and so on, that is provided by the local organizers. But from the moment the teams arrive, they take over the garages and start the work of setting up and customizing everything. Often, the layouts are identical to what is done at the Red Bull Ring in Monza, in Interlagos, and all over the world. After all, it's much easier to work in an office you know like the back of your hand. Also on Wednesday, usually, with a few exceptions, the drivers and main team members start to arrive. That's why Wednesday and to a lesser extent Thursday are the easiest days to get a selfie, an autograph, and so on. At the hotel entrance or at the circuit entrance with drivers and team principals, because on these days their schedules are more relaxed, not that they're empty. Because even though Wednesday's activities at the circuit are more relaxed for the drivers, they still have several promotional commitments as soon as they set foot on the ground. I remember talking this year with Paul Di Resta in the WEC, which has a much lighter schedule than Formula One, and he said that as soon as we landed at the airport, people were already there. We went to the hotel, took a shower, and immediately went to have lunch with the media. And from Wednesday onward, it's a whirlwind of promotional activities. After all, those who foot the bill want to make the most of their media assets, which are the drivers and team principals. That's why, on Wednesday, your chances of finding a driver at the circuit are lower. But by Thursday, it's already mandatory. Yes, all the drivers and all the team principals, at least the main team principal, need to be at the circuit because there are mandatory press conferences for the 20 drivers and the 10 team principals from each team. In addition, it's also the day when they usually schedule so-called exclusives with the media that broadcast Formula One, whether it's TV, radio, or print media personnel. While drivers and team principals are talking and fulfilling their media commitments, the team must have finished preparing the cars. And this isn't just a whim, it's a requirement of the regulations. Because even though the cars only go out on track on Friday morning, on Thursday, early in the day, the FIA garage is open, waiting for each of the cars for inspection and weighing. This inspection in Portuguese is called scrutineering, or scrutiny. From the stewards there in that garage, the cars go onto a scale and are measured. On this day, the teams also have to present to the federation any modification, any part that the car might use over the weekend. In other words, even if you do not intend to use a new front wing, a floor, or a suspension right in free practice 1, it still has to be presented to the FIA along with the design plans so that they know what is on the car. Why? You might ask me. Hold on, because we'll get to Saturday and Sunday, to what's called parc fermé, or in French, parc fermé. This weight of the car is added to the driver's weight after qualifying and after the race. You've probably seen them stepping onto a scale and someone recording their weight to make up then the final minimum weight of the car, which can sometimes cause a huge problem. We've had disqualifications more recently. George Russell, Lewis Hamilton, Charles Leclerc for excessive wear on the skid block underneath, also for minimum weight. The open garage time is usually hours so that all teams can take their two cars for weighing and measurements. And it's at this time that clever photographers take the opportunity to snap their shots, since the cars are usually taken slowly through the pit lane on skates, perfect for taking photos. And those keeping an eye on things aren't just professional media photographers, but also people from other teams who like to watch and check out the rivals' new features. When all this is wrapping up, drivers and team principals have already spoken to the press, given their statements, and we're here publishing our Thursday video, the famous media day. In the garage, the cars that have returned are started up. The engines usually run for a few minutes, that final check to see if there are any leaks, to make sure everything is in order. Also at the end of Thursday, the so-called technical briefings take place, preparatory meetings where the teams review step by step the schedule for Friday. Every minute on track is planned. We go out first with this wing, then with that one. Each car does something different. Full tank, empty tank, medium tires, hard tires, soft tires. At this moment during the briefings, it's also time to go over the weather forecast and find out, will we be able to do what we've planned? Do we have any doubts? Is it worth spending a lot of time on Friday and Saturday preparing a car for dry conditions when we know or there's a high chance it will rain on Sunday? Also on Thursday, there's the so-called track walk, when the track, already prepared, welcomes the drivers walking or riding their bikes. Walking if it's a short track like Interlagos, riding a bike if it's a huge one like Spa-Francorchamps. The drivers usually go around the entire circuit with their race engineer, checking out details, changes to the curbs, runoff areas where the asphalt has been resurfaced, and so on. I remember doing a WEC track walk last year where I caught a Toyota mechanic with a tape measure measuring the depth of the curb groove. Because that information definitely went into the technical briefing to warn, if you're going to hit the curb, be careful because it's X centimeters deep. Depending on the track, there's still room on Thursday for free practice sessions or even qualifying for support events such as Porsche Cup and historic car races, Formula 3 and Formula 2. And the VIPs, of course, get the chance to do the so-called pit lane walk also on Thursday, with everything emptier, sometimes even managing to catch a driver or a celebrity. Friday seems easy. Free practice 1, free practice 2, and that's it, right? But that's not all that happens. Besides the support categories, there's a schedule ritual that, if you've ever been to the racetrack, you might have noticed. 15 minutes before FP1, the safety or medical car drives by with a red flag, closing the track to the service vehicles that are circulating, transporting marshals, delivering meals, and handling all sorts of local tasks. From that point on, no one else is allowed to circulate except for the medical or safety car. And once the track is open, the Formula 1 cars. The schedule, of course, varies from country to country, and they always try to fit it into prime viewing hours for Europe. But generally speaking, FP1 is at 9 a.m., FP2 at noon. In the past, these sessions lasted 90 minutes, but that was reduced to 60, in other words, 1 hour. Once FP1 ends, depending on the schedule of each circuit, after half an hour or an hour, the next activity begins, which, as I mentioned, could be Porsche Cup, Formula 3, Formula 2, or here in Brazil, Formula 4. These activities keep happening until the track closes again and the same routine repeats. And then comes the second free practice session. At the end of both sessions, free practice 1 and free practice 2, the drivers leave the garage and must go through what's called the mixed zone. There, they have to speak with the accredited TV stations in that area, as well as with Formula One's own channel, where their statements are broadcast from. All the information gathered on Friday is compiled by the teams, and often the plans for Saturday are reviewed. And of course, they also take the weather forecast into account. So if someone had an engine, suspension, gearbox problem, etc., or had a crash, the team has a certain number of hours, usually until 11 p.m. to finish the repairs. And sometimes they might have to work through the night. But here, there's another rule. Nowadays, to prevent the exhausting work shifts that used to happen in the past, teams have a maximum number of times they can exceed the maximum working hours for mechanics to work into the night. In the past, this was common. Engines would be swapped out working through the early hours of the morning. Nowadays, there is a maximum limit for the so-called curfew, so teams save these wildcard hours for something truly essential. Crashing the car, being sure about a setup change that can be made, and so on. By the way, a story. From Friday to Saturday in Hungary, now in 2025, Bortoleto took responsibility and told Sauber, we need to change this, and this in the setup. And in this way, it would be necessary to break the so-called curfew, to go into those late night hours, which the team has a maximum allowance to do. I think it's 2 times per year. So what happened? Well, a rookie has to be really sure, and if it goes wrong, they lose a lot of credibility. If you make the mechanics pull an all-nighter, and the team uses up one of those wildcards for nothing to come of it, and it worked out. That's why the result in Hungary was so important for him within the team. He insisted, stood his ground, and said, I'm sure about what I'm saying. The team went there, broke the hours limit, delivered a car for him that made it to Q3, and then he finished in 6th place. Also, just an hour later, on Saturday morning, free practice 1 takes place. Once that's over, we have the support events, as I mentioned, the categories that surround Formula 1. And they use the track on the same weekend, and then, around mid-afternoon local time, when the race takes place, comes qualifying. Q1, Q2, and Q3. 18 minutes for the first part, where all 20 go out on track, and the top 15 advance. 15 minutes for the second part, where the 10 best qualify, and then 12 minutes for the final part, forming the top 10. Once qualifying is over, for some in Q1, others a bit later in quarter 2, or the group that makes it to quarter 3. Everyone passes through the mixed zone, gives their statements, and then returns to the garage. On this day, after qualifying, it's much harder to get access to the drivers because they stay much later discussing strategy and what to do in the race. Oh, and can you change the setup then? You can't. Well, you can, but there's a price to pay. Here, after qualifying, the Parc Fermé rules come into effect. What does that mean? Parc Fermé is a rule that states the cars can't undergo any kind of modification. They return to their garages, but there's a system of cameras and seals in place to prevent any changes from happening. If you really want to change an engine, a gearbox, a wing, and so on, you can do it, but you'll lose your qualifying time and be forced to start from the pit lane. That's why sometimes, if you had a terrible qualifying, crashed, set a bad time, and are starting from the back, you might feel tempted to change an engine, a gearbox, and so on. Because then you already serve the penalty and get a new engine or completely new parts for the race. Parc Fermé also applies after the race. But after the race, it's not that anyone is going to change anything, but the cars are inspected to check that they comply with Thursday's weighing and that the parts present are the same ones. Were previously presented and approved in that document. You see, everything has a reason for being. But on race Sunday, a lot happens. In the past, we used to have the so-called warm-up session, where the cars would run and usually test the setup that was then adjusted for race conditions, completely changing the rev ranges and fuel consumption compared to what was used on Saturday. Since in qualifying, you need maximum performance for 1 lap, and in the race, you need to make it to the end. Since nowadays there is no more warm-up, the drivers do arrive a bit later on Sunday. But even so, there is still a lot of activity with guests, VIPs who are welcomed inside the garage, and also the so-called parade lap. During this, the drivers are put on a truck and do a lap around the entire circuit, waving to the fans. It's during this pre-Grand Prix time, for example, that this year in Miami, Formula 1 put the 20 drivers in 10 giant Lego cars to compete in a friendly race. Or not so friendly, actually. But right after these games are over, the serious business begins. And the team's operations are carried out with military precision. Every minute counts, and you do not even need to go to Formula 1 to understand how these things work. I know some team principals in Brazil from various categories. A shout out to Grizzly from Porsche. On race day, they don't even have time to breathe. Everything has to be working. Unexpected events must have been anticipated. No one can be caught off guard. 40 minutes before the start, the pit lane opens. And from then on, a timed sequence of procedures needs to take place. No delays. No mistakes either, or else you risk throwing everything up in the air or down the drain. Take your pick. The pit lane opens, the cars start to go out, and during this period, they can leave, do a full lap, come back through the pit lane, and return to the garage. At this point, a conversation here or there, a procedure or two on the car can still be done. It's the time for those discussions. I think it's going to rain, these medium tires aren't working, and so on. With 32 minutes to go before the start then, 8 minutes after the pit lane opens, an alarm sounds, and the teams are notified through the system. Pit lane closes in 2 minutes. So, did you manage to get the car running and make it out onto the track? You did. You didn't? You'll be starting from the pit lane. If you're in the grandstands, you start to see that strange ritual of some cars leaving the pits and going straight to the grid. Others go through and do another lap. But they didn't signal in the pit lane and headed straight to their position. That's it. Now you only leave there when the lights go out. Meanwhile, your mechanics are running with all that support equipment to the grid precisely to wait for you there. Lined up on the grid, drivers usually get out, talk with their engineers, share last-minute thoughts, and yes, rush to the bathroom for one last pee. This conversation with the engineers is important because before they go to the grid, something might have happened on the track. Weather-wise, or maybe some big blunder in the categories that raced there before. The track might have more rubber laid down, or someone could have spilled oil. It could already be drizzling. There are countless variables. Meanwhile, the team has already plugged in the sensors and is doing a final check on the car to make sure everything is in order, because from that point on, it's just the car and the driver alone on the track. At the same time, they also do what's called a fire-up. Then the engine is started. They keep the engine at minimum revs, maintaining the heating of the components and the oil. This heating also happens with the electric blankets on the tires. From that point on, you already know. The broadcast starts, there's a national anthem, maybe a tribute to someone. Everyone gets into their cars, drivers are strapped in, engines are started, and then comes the formation lap. Formation lap of the grid, or here in Brazil, also called the presentation lap. Think it's over? No, it's not over. Once the race is over, and I'm not talking about the checkered flag because for some, as we know, it can end at the start due to some problem, the drivers are required one by one to go through the press pen. And whoever finishes the race, if they want to take the result home, must leave the car in Parc Fermé. And then it is weighed, measured, and compared to Thursday. Meanwhile, and often right after the start, the teams already begin, believe it or not, to dismantle the garage. Because if the car has already gone to the grid, for example, we know that the engine, gearbox, etc. won't be changed anymore, right? So, especially if we have back-to-back race weekends, it's time to start packing everything up because some things are no longer needed and can already be shipped off. Tough, isn't it? This is the hour-by-hour, minute-by-minute description of what happens from Thursday to Sunday at a racetrack. In Formula 1, when it's necessary to bring together the event schedule, the technical regulations, and the sporting regulations, and also the promotional commitments of drivers and teams, coordinating the Ferrari car's electric blanket with the singer performing the national anthem on the grid. The show with autographed caps in the fan zone overlapping with the Porsche Cup schedule, or the Formula 2, Formula 3, Formula 4 car that spilled oil and now FP3 will be delayed. For example, in all 24 Formula 1 weekends, the world in the host country always stays the same. Instagram? So that's it, you already know. Another episode of Splash and Go on YouTube. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like, it's free, it doesn't cost anything. You know it helps the channel a lot. Do me this favor, do us this favor. And don't forget to leave your comment with us, tell us where you're watching from. Let me know if you already knew about all this programming, don't want to share any of that. Send a shout out to your cat, your dog, your parakeet, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your spouse, anyone you like. I always ask for this because it helps the algorithm understand that you liked it, that you're still here, and it keeps spreading our content across the internet. On the way to 300,000 subscribers? So, you don't miss anything we do here. We have notification channels for you, Instagram, Telegram, and WhatsApp, right? And you'll start getting automatic updates. As soon as we publish any content, it's super convenient. The link is down below in the description with more than 2,000 members in each group. You'll get updates and won't have to rely on YouTube to remind you anymore. We also have a lot going on our social media. Instagram, Twitter, Threads, and TikTok, our handles are showing up here. Link down below in the description. And I'll see you all in the next video. Thanks.